There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a room when someone walks in, and the room decides before she opens her mouth, before she sets down her bag, before she even reaches the table, that she does not belong there. It is not a loud silence. It is not dramatic. Nobody gasps. Nobody points. It is just a very small, very practiced rearrangement of attention. Eyes that were open, close a little. Chairs that were angled toward the door, angle slightly away. The conversation does not stop. It just becomes a door with no handle on her side. She had felt that silence before. She knew its texture by heart. The way it lands on your shoulders like something wet. The way it makes you second-guess the decision to walk through the door at all. She had felt it in briefing rooms. In parking lots. In a moment before roll call when the older guys looked at each other, and then looked at her, and then looked at each other again. She had learned to walk through it anyway. What she had not learned, what nobody tells you, what no training manual covers, is what happens the day the silence breaks. Not because she demanded it break. Not because she fought loudly or flipped a table or made a speech anyone would remember. But because of a radio, because of a call sign, because of 4 words spoken in a tone of voice that made every person in that room go very, very still. This is the story of a woman who spent 3 years being treated like she was temporary. And the day the room finally understood she was not. Her name was Maya Reeves, and she had earned everything she owned twice. The first time she earned it, she did it the way everyone does. She studied, she trained, she passed the exams, she put in the hours. The second time, she earned it in the way only certain people are ever asked to. She had to prove it again, in front of people who had already decided the answer was no, who held the proof in their hands, and still found reasons to set it down. She joined the department at 26. She had a degree in criminal justice, a commendation from her internship supervisor, and a handshake from the chief that felt, in the moment, like an arrival. Like something had finally clicked into place. She drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was November, because she needed the cold air on her face to make the whole thing feel real. It felt real for about 9 days. The station she was assigned to was not a bad place. That is the honest thing to say about it. It was not a place full of cruel people or obvious villains. It was a place full of ordinary people who had calcified around a very specific idea of how things were supposed to work, and that idea had not been updated in a long time, and Maya did not fit inside it. She was young. She was a woman. She was black. And she came in with credentials that were better than half the rooms, which she would learn quickly was the specific combination most likely to make a room decide you were a problem before you had done a single thing. Her training officer was a man named Dennis Schraft. 17 years on the job. Forearms like architectural elements. A handlebar mustache that had been ironic in 2009 and had since committed fully to being sincere. Dennis was not a bad trainer. He knew procedure. He knew the streets of their district the way some people know scripture, fluently, and by feel, able to quote chapter and verse without looking it up. He took his job seriously, and he had, over 17 years, produced a number of competent officers. He did not know what to do with Maya. This is not something he would have ever said out loud. If you had asked him, he would have told you he treated all his trainees the same, and you would have believed it. That was the thing about Dennis. His blind spots were invisible to him, which made them permanent. He did not assign her the difficult calls because he did not want to throw her in too fast. He answered questions on her behalf in briefings because he was helping her get comfortable. He corrected her paperwork without showing her the corrections because he had done the same for the last 3 guys. He had not done the same for the last 3 guys. Maya noticed. She noticed everything because noticing was the only tool available to her in those first weeks. She could not push back. Too early, too risky, it would become the story instead of her work. She could not ignore it. Every time Dennis answered for her, every time someone called her Han in the break room, every time a senior officer looked past her to find a real person to talk to, she felt herself becoming smaller in the room's imagination. She was being installed into a category, and the category was temporary. She wrote things down, not in an official capacity, in a small green notebook she kept in her jacket pocket, the kind you could get at any drugstore for $1.25. She wrote dates and incidents and exact words, not because she had a plan yet, but because writing things down was a way of telling herself, this is real, you're not imagining it, you're not being too sensitive, this is actually happening. The notebook filled up faster than she expected. There was the incident in October, 3 months in, when a call came in about a domestic disturbance on Siler Road, and Maya was the first unit available, and she radioed in her position and drove toward it, and Dennis, who was not on duty, who was not her partner that day, somehow found out she was going solo and called her patrol car's radio directly to tell her to wait for backup, even though the protocol for that call type did not require it. She waited. Backup arrived 12 minutes later in the form of Officer Pete Garland, who was 6'2" and had been on the job for 4 years and had, by Maya's count, made exactly 0 more significant decisions than she had. Pete took point on the call. Maya stood behind him on the porch. There was the December briefing where Sergeant Hollis ran through a series of case updates and called on everyone in the room by last name: Garland, Torres, Wexler, Chin, Blackwood, and when he got to Maya said, "And our new girl is still getting up to speed, so we'll check in with her later." She had been on the job for 5 months. Pete Garland had been called by his last name on his 3rd week. There was the February training exercise where the department brought in an outside instructor to run a situational judgment course, and the instructor broke the group into teams, and the team assignments were posted on a board, and Maya's name was on the board under the heading Observers, not participants, observers, and when she went to the instructor and pointed at the board and said very carefully, "I think there may have been a mistake," the instructor looked at her for a moment and then looked at Dennis, and Dennis said she'll get more out of watching the first round, and the instructor nodded, and that was that. She watched the first round. She watched the second round. She was never moved to participant. She did not flip a table. She did not make a scene. She went back to her car at the end of the day and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes and breathed, and then she drove home and made dinner and called her mother, who had been a nurse for 31 years and who understood this specific flavor of institutional obstruction the way you understand something you have eaten your whole life. Her mother said, "Are you keeping records?" Maya said yes. Her mother said, "Good. Keep your head down, but keep your eyes open. Don't let them make you small." Maya said, "Okay." Her mother said, "I mean it. Do not let them make you small." Maya said, "Okay" again. She meant it both times. The thing that is hardest to explain about that first year and into the second is that none of it was cinematic. There was no single confrontation, no villain with a face you could describe to a sketch artist. It was accumulative. It was death by 1,000 small exclusions, each one of which was individually deniable, each one of which could be explained away as a misunderstanding or a coincidence or just the way things were done around here. The power of it was in the deniability. You could not point to one moment and say, there, that is the thing. The thing was all of it together, and all of it together was invisible to everyone except the person it was happening to. She went home and studied. Not because she needed to, her scores were already in the top tier, but because competence was the one thing they could not take away from her if she kept adding to it. She read case law. She read department policy manuals cover to cover twice until she knew the language of the institution better than most people who had been there a decade. She enrolled in a crisis negotiation course on her own time and her own money. She took a weekend seminar on evidence handling that was technically optional and that no one in her peer group attended because it was a Saturday in March and there was a game on. She was building something. She did not have a name for it yet, but she was building it. In her second year, the dynamic shifted slightly, not because anyone decided to change it, but because the caseload got heavy, and heavy caseloads have a way of stripping out ceremony. When there's too much to do, people stop performing hierarchy and start performing function. Maya was fast. She was accurate. Her reports were clean and cited correctly. She started getting assigned calls she would not have gotten in year one. Not because anyone acknowledged the upgrade, but because she was simply the available and capable unit, and there was too much work to waste her on observer duty. She handled a missing child call in September and found the kid in 4 hours through a combination of neighborhood canvassing and a hunch about a relative's address that turned out to be correct. She handled a fraud case in November that had been sitting cold for 2 months and cracked it by reading the financial records closely enough to catch a pattern 3 other officers had missed. She wrote both those reports with the same clean economy. She wrote everything, and the reports went into the file, and her name was on them, and that was all she asked. Dennis started giving her the lead on minor calls by the middle of year 2. He did not announce this. He did not say, "You've proven yourself, I was wrong about you." He just started stepping back a half step, letting her take the door first, letting her run the radio. She noticed. She accepted it without comment, because making a point of it would have made it smaller. Sergeant Hollis still called her our girl in briefings. She stopped correcting it out loud. She corrected it in the notebook. The notebook now lived in her desk drawer at home. She had filled 4 of them. She had also, quietly, over the course of those 2 years, built a record that was among the cleanest in the precinct. No disciplinary flags. No complaints. Commendation from a case supervisor in November. High marks on her 2nd annual review. Marks that Hollis delivered with a kind of mild surprise in his voice that he clearly did not notice was insulting. She sat across from him in his office and received the review with a straight face and said, "Thank you, Sergeant," and drove home and wrote it down. She was not waiting for permission. She was not waiting for them to decide she was ready. She was getting ready on her own schedule, and she knew something the room did not know yet, that there is a specific moment in any institution when competence accumulates past the point where it can be ignored. When the record becomes undeniable. When the performance of your smallness requires more energy than it used to because the evidence against it keeps growing. That moment was coming. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. A change in pressure, a shift in the quality of the air. She had no idea it would arrive the way it did. She had no idea it would arrive on a Tuesday afternoon with a radio call and a call sign and for words that would rearrange every room she walked into for the rest of her career. But she would be ready when it did. She had made sure of that. The Tuesday it happened was not a remarkable Tuesday. That is the important thing to understand. It was not a Tuesday that announced itself. The sky was the usual flat gray of early spring, the color of a sidewalk. The briefing that morning had the low-energy drag of a briefing where nothing urgent had come in overnight, the kind where Sergeant Hollis talked about permit renewal for departmental vehicles, and someone in the back row fell asleep with their eyes open. Maya had come in with a coffee from the gas station on Merritt Avenue because the department machine was broken again, which it had been since January, which no one had fixed because no one had decided whose responsibility it was. She had taken her usual seat, 3rd row, right side, close enough to hear, but not so close as to be conspicuous. She had been at the department 2 years and 8 months. The morning ran without incident. She handled 2 calls, both routine, a noise complaint on Vickers that resolved in 4 minutes once both parties were talked to separately, and a fender bender on the overpass where the drivers were fine, but both insisted on filing reports, and both wanted to tell their version of what happened in more detail than the situation required. She filed everything correctly. She drove her sector. She ate a sandwich in the car at noon because there was no good reason to go back to the station, and she preferred the quiet of the car to the specific quality of noise that came from the break room when Pete Garland was in there watching sports highlights on his phone. At 2:47 in the afternoon, the radio came alive. Not a radio specifically, the dispatch feed. The kind of call that opens on a channel and everyone in range can hear it. The kind that has a frequency and urgency in the dispatcher's voice that makes your hands move before your brain has fully processed the words. There was a situation developing at the Meridian Transit Hub downtown. A man in crisis, armed, had barricaded himself in the lower-level maintenance corridor. 2 transit officers were already on scene and had held perimeter. The man had not fired, but had made statements. It was the kind of situation that required someone with crisis negotiation training. Dispatch called for available units with relevant certification. In the entire sector, at that moment, There was one certified crisis negotiator on active patrol. Maya Reeves. She called in her availability before the dispatch had finished the sentence. She was already pulling a U-turn on Kellner Avenue, coffee still in the cup holder, sandwich wrapper still on the passenger seat. Her heart was doing the thing it does before something real. Not racing, not panic, just sharpening. A clarifying sensation. Like the resolution on everything around her had improved by 1 degree. Dispatch confirmed her as the responding negotiator. And then, this is the moment, the fulcrum of the whole story, though she did not understand it as that yet. Dispatch used the designation. Lead Negotiator Unit, Sector 4. Call sign, Reeves Primary. Reeves Primary. It was a procedural designation. It meant she was the certified lead on this incident. It meant all other responding units coordinated through her. It meant that for the duration of this call, she was not a junior officer who happened to be present. She was the anchor of the response. In terms of pure bureaucratic function, it was an automatic assignment, nothing more. The system assigned the certified person the lead designation. It was not a compliment. It was a protocol. But protocol is a language, and language lands differently depending on who is in the room when it is spoken. The radio channel that carried that designation was the channel that 4 other officers in the sector were monitoring. One of them was Pete Garland. One of them was Officer Marcus Chun, who had 6 years on the job. One of them was a plainclothes detective named Roy Sylvester, who had been on the force for 11 years and who had on multiple occasions referred to Maya in conversation as one of Hollis's projects. They all heard it. Reeves Primary. She arrived at the transit hub 9 minutes after the call. The 2 transit officers had held their positions well. The perimeter was clean, the corridor sealed, no civilians in the danger zone. She got out of her car and identified herself, and the transit sergeant, a compact, efficient woman named Dolores Park, gave her the briefing in the kind of fast, clean sentences that emergency professionals use when time is a factor. The man in the corridor was named Gerald. 43. History of mental health crisis. Had been employed by the Transit Authority for 6 years before medical leave 3 months ago. Was not, as far as Dolores could tell, making tactical statements. Was making the kind of statements you make when you are at the edge of something and you want someone to know you are at the edge before you go over. Maya listened to all of it without interrupting. She asked 4 questions. She took off her jacket because the corridor was going to be warm and she needed to move freely. She asked Dolores to keep everyone back from the corridor entrance. Everyone, including any other responding officers. And Dolores looked at her for 1 second with a look that means I am assessing whether I trust you. And then she nodded and said, "Your call, Reeves Primary." And that was that. What happened in the next 91 minutes is the kind of thing that is hard to write without making it sound like a movie, because the truth of it is quieter and more specific than movies allow. Maya talked to Gerald. She did not talk at him. She did not perform reassurance or run a script. She talked to him the way you talk to someone who is drowning, not telling them to calm down, not promising everything is fine, but finding the exact rope of words that can travel the distance between 2 people and hold weight. She found out about the job. She found out about the medical leave. She found out about a daughter in Tucson who had not called in 4 months, and the specific silence of a phone that used to ring. She found out that the thing Gerald needed most in this moment was not a tactical team or a department psychologist on speakerphone. It was someone who would stand at the other end of the corridor and treat the things he said as if they mattered. She stood there for 91 minutes. At the end of those 91 minutes, Gerald set down the weapon and sat down on the floor, and Maya walked to him and sat down across from him, and they talked for another 12 minutes before the medical team came in. Nobody got hurt. She came out of that corridor, and the first thing she saw was Pete Garland, who had arrived as a support unit and had been standing at the perimeter the entire time. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not admiration, exactly. Something more complicated. The expression of a person revising something they thought they understood. He said that was, and then stopped. She waited. He said, "That was good work." She said, "Thanks, Pete." She went back to her car and wrote it in her notebook. Not the compliment. The time, 4:58 p.m. The outcome, the call sign she had been assigned. She wrote it in the same plain handwriting she had used to document every small exclusion for 2 years and 8 months. Reeves primary. Suspect in custody. No injuries. The report she filed that evening was 12 pages and perfectly organized and cited the crisis negotiation protocols she had studied on her own time with her own money on a Saturday in March when there had been a game on. But the thing that happened that night that she did not write in the notebook, the thing that was quiet and hard to name and that she felt in the way you feel a change in altitude, was the phone call. Sergeant Hollis called her at 7:14 p.m. He did not usually call. Communication was usually through the department system, official and documented. The fact that he was calling her personal phone meant he was operating outside the official channel, which meant what he wanted to say was not the kind of thing he wanted documented. He said, "Good response today, Reeves." She said, "Thank you, Sergeant." He said, "That kind of work that's the kind of thing that gets noticed." She held the phone and looked at the wall of her apartment and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite fury and lived precisely in the space between them. She said, "I appreciate you saying so." He said there would be a debrief in the morning. She said she would be there. He said good night. She said good night. She put the phone down. She sat for a long time in the quiet of her apartment. 3 years of notebooks. 3 years of a room that had decided before she opened her mouth. 3 years of being called our girl in briefings and being moved to the observer column in training exercises and having questions answered on her behalf by a man with a handlebar mustache who believed sincerely that he was helping. And tonight it took Hollis 8 minutes after a radio call to use her last name. She did not celebrate. She did not cry. She sat with the particular feeling of someone who has been waiting for something so long that when it arrives, it does not feel like victory. It feels like confirmation. She already knew what she was. She had known it for years. Tonight the room had simply caught up. She opened her laptop and pulled up the Departmental Crisis Negotiation Certification Registry and checked whether her advanced recertification exam, the one that would move her from field level to trainer eligible, was still open for registration. It was. She registered. She closed the laptop. Tomorrow the debrief. Tomorrow the room, rearranged. Tomorrow Hollis using her last name in front of people who had spent 3 years looking past her to find someone else. She was ready for tomorrow. She had been ready for a long time. The debrief was at 9 in the morning, and Maya arrived at 8:43. Not because she was nervous. She had moved past nervous somewhere around year 2, somewhere around the 4th notebook. She arrived early because she had learned in a specific way that women learn things in rooms that were not built with them in mind, that being first in the room means something. It means the room forms around you instead of the other way around. It means when people walk in and see the configuration of chairs and the name on the whiteboard and the person already seated at the table, they're doing the rearranging. You're not. She set her notebook on the table, the green one, the current one, notebook number 5, and her coffee from the gas station on Merritt, and she sat in the chair at the center of the table and waited. Dennis came in first. He saw her and did the thing his face does when it is recalibrating, a small, almost imperceptible reset, like a screen refreshing. He had heard about the transit hub. Everyone had heard about the transit hub. He nodded at her and said, "Morning," and sat down. And the fact that he sat across from her rather than at the head of the table told her everything she needed to know about what the last 18 hours had done to the architecture of the room. Pete Garland came in next and sat beside Dennis without making eye contact with anyone. Then Chun. Then 2 officers from the adjacent sector who had been monitoring the radio feed the previous afternoon and had apparently been asked to attend the debrief because their units had been in support range. They introduced themselves to Maya in the way people introduce themselves when they already know who you are, but want to establish that you know they know, with a slight directness, a slight formality, a handshake that held a half-second longer than a handshake between strangers usually does. Roy Sylvester, the plainclothes detective, 11 years, the one who called her one of Hollis's projects, came in last. He was a compact, dry-voiced man whom Maya had always read as aggressively lateral in his attention. He looked at everything except whatever was most important in the room as a way of communicating that he had already assessed the room and found it beneath detailed examination. He came in, looked at the table, looked at the whiteboard, looked at Maya. Then he pulled out a chair and sat without saying a word, and the absence of a word was its own kind of acknowledgement. Hollis came in at 8:59, which was unusual because Hollis was never less than 5 minutes early. He came in and looked at the room and looked at Maya, and there was a moment, very brief, the length of an intake of breath, where Maya saw on his face the same recalibration she had seen on Dennis's face, and then it was gone, and he was professional and efficient and called the room to order and said, "Let's start with Reeves walking us through the incident." Reeves. No, our girl. No, let me check in with her later. Her last name. Clean. Even. The way a name is used when it belongs to someone in the room takes seriously. She walked them through it. She had prepared for this debrief the way she prepared for everything. Thoroughly, without assuming credit would be handed over without documentation. She had the timeline written out, the procedural decision points, the risk assessment she had made, and the specific language she had used at the key moments in the corridor, and why she had used it. Not because she was covering herself, because this was her work, and it deserved to be explained fully, and she was not going to let it become a vague story of things went well that could be absorbed by the institution without her name attached. She talked for 22 minutes. Nobody interrupted. At the end, Hollis asked questions. Good ones. The kind that signaled genuine engagement rather than the kind designed to find the gap. Shin asked a question about the transition moment when Gerald sat down, what she had seen that told her it was safe to approach. She answered it in detail. Pete Garland asked nothing, which was its own kind of acknowledgement that he had nothing to find fault with. Roy Sylvester said, the corridor protocol you used, the distance maintenance, and the positioning, that's not standard academy training. She said, it's from the Advanced Crisis Negotiation Certification. I completed it last year. He looked at her. On your own time? He said. Yes, she said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he is updating a file he didn't expect to update. He said nothing else for the rest of the debrief. The debrief ended at 10:15. People filed out with the low, loose energy of a meeting that went longer than expected, but landed cleanly. Maya stayed to gather her notebook. Dennis lingered. She could feel him lingering the way you feel a presence that wants to say something and is figuring out the right approach. He said, that negotiation cert. When did you take that? She said, March, year before last. He said, the Saturday one? The weekend seminar? She said yes. There was a pause that had a specific shape to it. The shape of a man realizing something that had been true for a while and was only now arriving in the part of his brain where he could see it. He said, I didn't know you'd done that. She looked at him. She did not say, you were the one who put me in the observer column at the training exercise. She did not say, I asked to participate and you said I'd get more out of watching. She did not say any of the 17 things that were true and available. She had not stored them in 5 notebooks in order to use them as weapons in this moment. She had stored them because writing things down was the way she had kept herself sane. The notebooks were hers. This moment was hers. She said, I've been doing a lot of things you didn't know about. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he nodded, and the nod was not Dennis performing acknowledgement. It was actually him doing it. He left. She stood in the empty room for a moment. The whiteboard behind her still had her name on it. Reeves in block letters in the center under the heading Incident Lead. She looked at it for a second. Then she erased it because she did not need it anymore. It had done its work. The weeks that followed were not a fairy tale. Nobody threw her a party. Nobody gave a speech about how wrong they had been. The institution moved the way institutions move, slowly, and by adjustment rather than acknowledgement, and in ways that only made full sense if you had been watching from the beginning. The adjustments were real, though. She was asked to run the next situational judgment training exercise. Not observe. Run. She scheduled it for Saturday and sent the invitation to the whole sector, and the the sign-up filled in 3 days. Hollis began CC&G her on-case communications she had previously been excluded from. Not officially included, just present, which is how institutional change usually arrives, through inclusion rather than announcement. Roy Sylvester stopped calling her one of Hollis's projects. She knew because the officer he had said it to, a woman named Tanya Brecht who had started 6 months after Maya, and who had come to Maya quietly in the parking lot one afternoon and said, "I just want you to know I heard him say that, and I didn't say anything, and I should have." Tanya told her that Sylvester had not said it again. Not to her. Not to anyone she could tell. She registered for the trainer-eligible recertification exam. She passed it on the first attempt with the second highest score recorded at the regional center that year. The score was posted in the department newsletter. 3 weeks later, Hollis called her into his office and told her the department was being asked to nominate an officer for a regional crisis negotiation advisory panel. The panel met quarterly and helped develop training protocols for departments across the region. The department was nominating her. She sat across from Hollis in the same office where he had delivered her second-year review with mild surprise in his voice, and she received the nomination with a straight face and said, "Thank you, Sergeant." Same words as before. Different room. She drove home with the windows down even though it was March, because she needed the cold air on her face to make the whole thing feel real. And it did feel real. And it felt different from the day she had driven home after the chief's handshake. Not the breathless feeling of arrival, not the specific joy of beginning. Something steadier, something that had weight. She had built this over 3 years and 5 notebooks and a Saturday seminar and 91 minutes in a corridor and a call sign spoken on a radio channel where the right people were listening. She had not waited to be recognized. She had become undeniable, which is a different thing and a harder thing, and a thing that belongs entirely to the person who did the work. She got home. She made dinner. She called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring and said, "Tell me." Maya said, "They put me on a regional advisory panel." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Did you let them make you small?" Maya said, "Oh." Her mother said, "Good." That was all. They talked about other things for an hour. Her mother's patients, a cousin's new apartment, a book they had both read and disagreed about. Ordinary things. The conversation of two people who love each other and have earned the right to talk about nothing important because the important thing had already been said. Maya went to bed that night and thought about Gerald. She thought about the corridor and the rope of words and the way he had looked at her when she sat down across from him on the floor of that maintenance corridor. Not like a police officer, not like an institution, but like a person who had decided his words mattered. She hoped his daughter had called. She had not been able to follow up through official channels, but she had thought about him. She thought about the first time she had walked into the briefing room and felt the silence adjust around her. She thought about the notebook, the first one, the $1.25 kind from the drugstore. She thought about her mother's voice on the phone that first November. "Do not let them make you small." She had not. There are a lot of things the institution would eventually record about Maya Reeves, the panel appointment, the training record, the commendations that came after, the promotion she received 14 months later, and the one after that. The institution would record all of those things cleanly and put them in a file, and the file would grow, and it would tell to anyone who read it the story of a highly effective officer. The file would not record the 5 green notebooks. It would not record the Tuesday in March when she sat in the car for 11 minutes after an observer column put her name where it did not belong. It would not record the phone call from Dennis in year 1 when she had been kept from a solo response she was qualified to run. It would not record the briefing where Hollis had called her our girl in front of 30 people and expected her to absorb it like weather. It would not record what it cost to stay in that room and keep building something day after day in a place that had decided before she opened her mouth that she was temporary. She was not temporary. She had never been temporary. She had just been waiting, patiently, deliberately, at enormous personal cost, for the room to catch up to what she already knew about herself. The room caught up. It always does, eventually, when the person who is right refuses to become invisible. The call sign shifted the power. But Maya Reeves had laid the foundation. One notebook, one certification, one Tuesday morning in the right chair, long before the radio spoke her name.